If you have your Bibles, I'd ask you to turn to 2 Samuel chapter 3. 2 Samuel chapter 3 in the Old Testament. Much of the Old Testament is narrative, and 2 Samuel is no exception to that. It shows the hand of God in the lives of people, and to the degree that they obey and His word and honor Him is the degree to which He can use them as they cooperate with Him. And to the degree that they don't, we see life not working out for them, and we see judgment from God upon those people or groups, even entire nations. That's different from much of the New Testament, those formal letters that were written to churches or individuals from the apostles. We call them epistles, and much of the epistles represent propositional truth rather than narrative. This is true, and this is true, so this is true. And sometimes examples are given or illustrations in those letters to help us understand what truth is being communicated. But oftentimes it's just, here's the truth, and here's another truth, and they build upon one another. Different from narrative. And yet God puts both of those kinds of literature in the Bible for us to help illustrate truth and put flesh on it, if you will, so that we can understand it. Well, we're in 2 Samuel chapter 3. I've entitled this, 3 Men, 4 Choices. The 3 men are Abner, Joab, and David. All very prominent, principal, strong leaders in their day in the ancient country of Israel. And they all had choices to make. And we're going to see that only one of these men made choices that were completely honoring to God, at least in this text and as the events unfolded in 2 Samuel chapter 3. We start in verse 1. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. And then verses 2 through 5 list the sons, 6 of them, who were born to David at Hebron, the place where he first served as king over Judah for 7.5 years. And so we've got these 7 years of war between the house of David and the house of Saul. Saul and 3 of his older sons are dead and gone by now. But the house of Saul, run and ruled by Ishbosheth, the 4th son of Saul, is fighting against David for these 7+ years. And the text tells us in verse 1 that we've got David and his household growing stronger and stronger as time goes on, and the house of Saul, Ishbosheth, grows weaker and weaker as the days go on. Why? Because God is fighting for David and fighting against Saul. See, that's that narrative that we see in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the gospel accounts, where you see God and His hand at work, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes out in front, and using people who are serving Him with their whole heart and to accomplish His will, and blessing them as a result. And this is an example of that. Well, we're going to see these 3 men and these 4 choices. So the first man and the first choice that we see is found in verses 6 through 21. Abner chooses to be a kingmaker. Abner chooses to be a kingmaker. And the first thing that we see here in verses 6 through 11 is that Abner makes himself strong in the house of Saul. I want to read verses 6 through 11. While there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" And Abner was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth and said, "Am I a dog's head of Judah? To this day I keep showing steadfast love to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not given you into the hand of David. And yet you charge me today with a fault concerning a woman?" Verse 9, God do so to Abner, and more also, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan to Beersheba. And Ishbosheth, verse 11, could not answer Abner another word because he feared him. Abner's first choice is to be a kingmaker, or his choice is to be a kingmaker, and he makes himself strong in the house of Saul. And notice the wording there, that he made himself strong in the house of Saul with Ishbosheth, the king, the son of Saul. That's compared to David, who we read about in 1 Samuel chapter 30 and verse 6. You remember he comes back from being with the Philistines with his fighting men to his adoptive hometown of Ziklag and finds that all the women and children have been kidnapped and they're gone, and the town has been put to the flame, and they're sitting there in the ruins of the town, and his own men are thinking about stoning him to death. And the text tells us that David found strength in the Lord. That was the pattern of David's life from the time he was very young, all the way through at least the first half of his kingship, and really even the second half of his kingship, after he sinned and then repented of that sin after a year of being away from the Lord. But David looked to the Lord, his God, for strength. And not so with Abner. Abner was busy playing politics and maneuvering and posturing and moving the chess pieces all over the board to put himself forward and somebody else back, and he didn't know what it meant to look to the Lord for strength. He only looked to himself and his own ability for strength. Abner was calling the shots in Ishbosheth's kingdom. Abner was the one who had made Ishbosheth king in the first place. Remember, that's our point. He wants to be a kingmaker. He's already done it once, and now he wants to do it again. It seemed like it worked the first time, at least for a while, and he's going to try the same course of action. Abner is acting like he owns the place, and humanly speaking, well, he kind of does, and he's aware of that. He takes his father's concubine as his own, and Ishbosheth confronts him on that because Abner is acting like a king. Only a king would take another king's concubine for himself. And that's exactly what Abner does. And Ishbosheth confronts him on it. Abner reacts very angrily. And basically what he says, being interpreted from that Hebrew phrase there, he says, "Am I a commander of a pack of dogs? Who are you talking to? You talking to me like that? What are you accusing me of? How dare you even have the gall to bring something like this up? Ishbosheth, do you know who you are? Do you know who made you king?" Well, keep in mind that dogs were unclean animals back in those days. They didn't have them as indoor pets, oftentimes like we do here in the United States. And so he's trying to find the most debased kind of position that somebody could have, the commander of a group of dogs. To say, that's how you're treating me. That's how you're talking to me, Ishbosheth. I don't appreciate it, and believe me, you're not going to get away with it. And so he reminds Ishbosheth that so far he, Abner, had not handed him over to David. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't be king. In fact, the kingdom wouldn't be yours. He promises now at this time, because he's so offended, to transfer the kingdom over to David as a result of the insult. Well, that's the pretense that he uses. But he saw the handwriting on the wall. He could see over a 7-year period that the house of Saul was growing weaker and weaker despite all of his best efforts, and the house of David was growing stronger and stronger because of the hand of God. And interestingly enough, in these verses, he invokes the Lord's will in his threat. Only now does he care about the Lord and the Lord's will, not over the last 7 years, not even prior to that, when he was helping King Saul chase David all around the country. But he brings this up like, God promised the kingdom to David, and guess what? I'm going to help him get it. And so all of a sudden now he's so self-righteous. The Bible tells us there in the last verse that I read, verse 11, that Ishbosheth, he didn't answer Abner a word. He's weak and he's afraid. And so he keeps silent. So that's what we see to begin with. Abner, in choosing to be a kingmaker, makes himself strong in the house of Saul. And secondly, as he chooses to be a kingmaker, he makes himself strong in the house of David. And we see that in verses 12 through 21. Follow along as I read. And Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf, saying, "To whom does the land belong? Make your covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you to bring over all Israel to you." And he said, "Good, I will make a covenant with you. But one thing I require of you," that is David to Abner, "that is, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face." Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, "Give me my wife Michal, for whom I paid the bride price of 100 foreskins of the Philistines." And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, Paltiel, the son of Laish. But her husband went with her, weeping after her, all the way to Bahurim. And Abner said to him, "Go, return." And he returned. And Abner conferred with the elders of Israel, and saying, "For some time past you have been seeking David as king over you. Now then, bring it about. For the Lord has promised David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines, and from the hand of all their enemies." Abner also spoke to Benjamin. And then Abner went to tell David at Hebron, and all Israel and the whole house of Benjamin thought good to do. When Abner came with 20 men to David at Hebron, David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And Abner said to David, "I will arise and go, and will gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. Abner made himself strong in the house of David. He offered to bring the northern tribes under the control of David. He asked this rhetorical question that was provided an obvious answer to David, but maybe not so obvious to us. We're left wondering, did he mean this or did he mean that, based upon the phrase that he chose, the question that he asked. He says, "To whom does the land belong, David?" This is the message that he sent to David. And it could have been pointing to himself, like, isn't it obvious? It's up to me to make you king, and I can bring the northern tribes over to your side. I made Ishbosheth king. I can make you king as well. Or was he pointing to David? Because he knew, and he even referenced the fact that the Lord had anointed and promised the kingship to David. And so whether he means himself because he's so arrogant, or he means David because, hey, you know God promised this to you, it was obvious what he was saying. Listen, we can make this happen, and I can bring it about. David's requirement is that Michal, his wife, his first wife, the princess, King Saul's daughter, who had been given to him in marriage, that she now be returned to him. In fact, it's interesting. He says Michal, Saul's daughter, as he's giving the message back to Abner, responding to his offer. That's how he refers to Michal, as Saul's daughter. It's a way to emphasize the reality of what Abner is proposing. Hey, listen, you understand what you're suggesting is turning the kingship from Saul's family to me and to my family. And that includes giving me back Saul's daughter, the princess, as my wife. David then makes the same demand of Ishbosheth, complete with the claim that he has on her. He says, "Listen, I paid a very hefty dowry for her. I killed not 100 Philistines, which was required of me by her father, my father-in-law, King Saul, but 200 of them, to show my enthusiasm for the idea." And so that's what he tells Ishbosheth, who obliges David. And her second husband, the man that Michal had been given to after he had been after she had been taken away from David, follows her. The commentators believe about 20 miles when the place names are referenced and you look on the ancient map of Israel, he follows behind her 20 miles, weeping all the way until Abner finally says, "Go home." It's a lost cause. You're not getting her back. She's being returned to her first and rightful husband. We got a lot of weak men here. Ishbosheth is one of them. He's afraid of Abner, his commander. We've got this husband, the second husband of Michal. He seems to be a weak man as well. Michal herself seems to be a strong woman. She rescued David's life when Saul was trying to find him on one occasion. And then later when she's returned to David, she stands up against him, wrongfully so, but she does just that when he is celebrating the return of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to Jerusalem. Well, Abner confers with the elders of Israel, including those from the tribe of Benjamin, Saul's home tribe, and encourages them to make David king over them. And Abner tells them that the Lord will use David to rescue them from the Philistines, their arch enemy, and then from all their other enemies, those that surround them. And then Abner and 20 of his men come to David at Hebron and tell him that he, Abner, will bring the tribes together to make David king. So David hosts Abner and his 20 men, and then he sends them away in peace after feeding them, giving them a banquet. Abner, you see, is positioning himself nicely as the person that David, the new king of Israel, will be most indebted to. That was the thinking pattern of Abner. It was well ingrained in him for years and years, decades, that you move around the pieces of life to your own advantage. That's what he did when he served Saul. That's what he did when Saul died and he ran and made Ishbosheth king. And that's what he's trying to do now. He's trying to be a king maker, because life is all about using power and influence and resources to ask yourself the question, what's best for me? As opposed to, what does God want me to do? Regardless of whether it's going to work out well for me or not. And so we set Abner up as a bad example, one not to follow. And yet, God was still using him as the drama unfolds for us in the life and times of David and the nation of Israel, God's covenant people. Well, we see that Abner chose to be a king maker. And number two, David chooses to be a peacemaker. And that's what we see in verses 22 to 25. Verse 22, just then the servants of David arrived with Joab from a raid, bringing much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David at Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the army that was with him came, it was told Joab, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he has let him go, and he has gone in peace. Then Joab went to the king and said, what have you done? Behold, Abner came to you. Why is it that you have sent him away so that he is gone? You know that Abner the son of Ner came to deceive you, and to know you're going out and you're coming in, and to know all that you are doing. David chooses to be a peacemaker, and the first thing we see here is that David sent Abner away in peace instead of killing him. That's what we read in verse 22. Abner had helped Saul chase David from one hiding place to another over the course of several years. He then led the country in a civil war against David for 7 more years. And then how does David treat him when he finally has him in his grasp? When Abner is vulnerable, when he can do whatever he wants to his arch enemy, well, he treats him like a guest of honor, and he sends him away not as an enemy, but as a friend. David's treatment toward Abner was consistent with how he treated Saul. David only fought, listen to this, to defend himself, not to avenge himself when it came to his own people. Now, he would take offensive stances against God's enemies, the Amalekites and the Philistines and so on and so forth. But when it came to his own people, his brothers, his fellow Israelites, members of God's covenant chosen people, he would not fight them. He wouldn't lift up his sword against them. He'd let God handle that. His wife, Abigail, had taught him this lesson. When he was so angry, he wanted to kill Abigail's husband, Nabal, and all the men of Nabal's household. And Abigail influenced him to refrain from acting in anger and letting the Lord fight his battles. David did that. God came through and took the life of Nabal, and then David was able to marry Abigail. He could not have orchestrated all that himself. Oh, he could have killed Nabal and all the men of his household, and he could have taken Abigail as his wife as a result of spoils of war and all that kind of thing. But then, as Abigail told him, you would have blood guilt on your hands. And this way, God took care of avenging him, and he didn't have to do any of that. And God blessed him as a result. So we see there David choosing to be a peacemaker. He sends Abner away in peace instead of killing him. And then verses 23 through 25, which I already read, Joab chastens David for sending Abner away in peace instead of killing him. Joab is not interested in making peace or encouraging David to do so. Joab does not see God at work, the promise of God for David to be king. Instead, he can only see Abner at work. And I've got to work against him. And God's out of the picture here, or he wants me to do things my own way. Joab was Abner's counterpart. He understood how his arch enemy thought. He had studied his strategies for years now in an effort to outmaneuver him in constant political and military chess match that they'd been playing across the game board of Israel. And that's what you see all throughout history, military history. Opposing generals are trying to get into the mind of the other one and figuring out what is he going to do next? How does he act? How does he think? And Joab had been doing that. And so that's why he couldn't understand why David had chosen to be a peacemaker. In fact, he made a totally different choice, and that's what we see in the next part of our passage, verses 26 through 30. Joab chooses to be a revenge seeker. Abner, a kingmaker. David, a peacemaker. And Joab, a revenge seeker. So let me read verses 26 through 30. When Joab came out from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern of Sirah. But David did not know about it. And when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the midst of the gate to speak with him privately. And there he struck him in the stomach so that he died for the blood of Asahel, his brother. Afterward, when David heard of it, he said, I and my kingdom are forever guiltless before the Lord for the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. May it fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle at Gibeon. Joab chooses to be a revenge seeker, and the first thing we see about that is that Joab uses treachery as a means to seek revenge, and we see that in verses 26 and 27. He sent messengers to Abner to bring Abner back to Hebron without David's knowledge or authorization. He deceived Abner into thinking that they would be discussing matters of state privately. Step over here with me. We're both top generals. This is really important. I don't want anybody else to hear. Abner, come over here. Let's talk in hushed tones. And when he gets him over there, he kills him, interestingly enough and purposefully enough, the same way that Abner had killed Joab's brother at the Battle of Gibeon, by running him through in his stomach. This time Joab used a sword to kill Abner. Abner had used the blunt end of his spear to kill Asahel. Only the difference was Abner was trying very hard not to kill Asahel. He was trying to talk him out of it, if you'll remember that. Stop chasing me. How could I look your brother in the face if I end up having to kill you? And he doesn't use the point end of the spear. He uses the other end. But Asahel is so fleet of foot. The Bible says that he runs like a gazelle. And his forward propulsion, his momentum, as Abner steps out and tries to stop him, he literally runs him right through his stomach. And that knowledge did not escape Joab. And Joab had plotted and planned for years. It was 7 years ago that had happened. Listen, I am going to take that man down. And if at all possible, I'm going to kill him the same way that he killed my brother. And so he killed him to avenge the death of his brother Asahel. He used treachery as a means to seek revenge. And secondly, we see him choosing to be a revenge seeker by being cursed by David for seeking revenge. And that's what we see in verses 28 through 30. David declares himself and his kingdom guiltless for the blood of Abner. People, I think of Cain, who killed his brother Abel, and kingdoms. We can think of the Canaanites. We can think of the Egyptian empire, the Babylonians, the Persians, even ancient Israel after they became completely apostate. Kingdoms are held accountable by God for blood guilt. That is the shedding of the blood of innocent people. And that's why I wrote what I did on our last prayer guide. If you look on the back of that, a whole page there about a very brief and brutal history of legalized abortion in the United States of America. So that to the 60 million souls never had the opportunity to breathe their first breath. And I believe with all my heart, as someone who is called to be a preacher of righteousness, that our nation will be held accountable for failing to protect and then for actively killing those innocent souls. And I believe that those days are coming and may have even started as we enter into the year 2021. Well, David understood this. It's just an inherent truth. God will not let the guilty go unpunished. And so David instead pronounces judgment on Joab and his family for this murder. He says, hey, there's going to be curses upon you. And he references them. The first three curses are physical ailments. And the next is war. And the last is famine. You see there, he references, may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge. And that can refer to a bloody discharge, other bodily fluids, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle. That phrase in the Hebrew can be translated, who leans on a crutch. If you have the NIV, that's how they translate that. Or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread, experiences both war and famine. Joab's brother, the text tells us, Abishai, joins in the act of treachery and murder. And then we get to the fourth choice, and we're back to David again. David chooses not to be a kingmaker, not to be a seeker of revenge, but to be a seeker of righteousness. And that's what we see in verses 31 to 39. Then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and mourn before Abner. And King David followed the bier. And they buried Abner at Hebron. And the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king, that is David, lamented for Abner, saying, should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And all the people wept again over him. Then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was yet day. But David swore, saying, God do so to me, and more also, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down." And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as everything that the king did pleased all the people. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's will to put to death Abner the son of Ner. And the king said to his servants, "Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I was gentle today. Though anointed king, these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are more severe than I. The Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness." David chooses to be a seeker of righteousness, verses 31 to 39. The first thing we see here is that David honors Abner in his death, verses 31 to 37. He requires, listen to this, Joab and his men, Abner's murderer, and the men who follow Abner's murderer, to attend and participate in the funeral. He says, "Listen, Joab, you and your men, tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourn before Abner." The wording there suggests that you're supposed to go in front of the casket in the funeral procession. Well, the word casket is a word that we use and we're familiar with. It's common in our American culture. But he would have had a bed or a couch that he would have been laid out on. That is Abner. And then David presents a lament for Abner, just as he had done for King Saul and his sons. That's recorded for us in 2 Samuel chapter 1. David fasts for the entire day of the funeral. And the people are convinced that David had nothing to do with the murder of Abner. And they're right. So David honors Abner in his death. And then secondly, David says the same thing privately as he does publicly. I love this about David. Verses 38 and 39 are evidence that he wasn't your typical politician. Get out there, make a flowery speech, read from the teleprompter. That's what I'm pretending to believe and say with emotion. My lip quivers, and all of that. And then you go behind closed doors and you say, "I don't care about this, I don't care about that. We just want to do this and that." And hopefully they bought it. Hopefully that speech went over well. Hopefully my poll numbers will go up. And unfortunately, so many politicians do that. But David says the same things privately as he did publicly. Now he's in verses 38 and 39. He's talking to his servants, not the crowds, not the people who believed that he was being sincere and that he was very sad over the murder of Abner. And the fact is, he was. This should never have happened. That's why I wrote a lament for him and wept and cried and had this big state funeral and had him buried in the royal city of Hebron, my former arch enemy, because no one should have to die like that, especially someone that I had promised safe conduct to. He honors Abner and he condemns the actions of Joab. Well, we have a short conclusion as we think about 2 Samuel chapter 3, and that is this: don't spend your life trying to be a king maker or seeking revenge. These activities require you to attempt to be in control of your life and your circumstances. You're not qualified to be in control. Eventually, at some point, it's not going to work out the way you hoped, the way you wanted. You're just going to make a mess because you and we aren't God. God's the only one who's capable of controlling events like that. Instead, seek to be a peacemaker and pursue righteousness, like David did throughout this chapter. These activities, being a peacemaker and pursuing righteousness, are evidence that you're trusting God with your life and with your circumstances and allowing Him to work in His time and in His way. That's our takeaway from 2 Samuel chapter 3. We've got 2 examples to avoid and 1 example to follow, and the work of God and the ways of God overarching all of it. And so I commend to you David, I commend to you his God, and would encourage you to avoid those bad examples. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for 2 Samuel chapter 3, for this historic and biblical account of what really happened in the lives of people. Lord, I pray that it will not just be interesting facts that we're filling our heads with, that we've got more Bible knowledge now, but Lord, that it would affect our lives, where we live, and that, Lord, we would not try to be kingmakers or revenge seekers, Lord, but we would be pursuers of righteousness and pursuers of peace, especially with our brothers and sisters in Christ. In his name I pray, amen.